foods that were secretly considered sinful in medieval times. To understand the medieval table is to decipher a map of the cosmos, a mirror of the soul, and a treaty with God. Food was never merely sustenance, it was a dense text written in broth and bread, flesh and spice, encoding divine law, social order, and mortal peril. While the church thundered against the sins of gluttony and lust from the pulpit, a quieter, more insidious drama unfolded in the cloister, the castle kitchen, and the peasant's pot. Certain foods carried a charge, a whisper of transgression that went beyond mere excess. They were secretly considered sinful not because they were always forbidden, but because they existed in a liminal space, tempting the spirit, confusing the hierarchy, and threatening to unravel the carefully constructed fabric of a world ordered by God. This is not a history of explicit prohibitions, but of shadows and suspicions. It is the story of how taste became theological, and how the longing for a flavor could feel like a step towards damnation. The theological appetite, a framework of fear and desire. The medieval Christian universe was predicated on balance. The body, a temporary vessel for the soul, was a battleground. The 7 deadly sins were not mere abstractions but physiological and spiritual realities. Gluttony gula stood prominently among them, a gateway sin that led to sloth, lust, and pride. But gluttony was more than eating too much. The 6th century theologian Pope Gregory I delineated 5 precise ways to commit gluttony. Eating too soon pre-prepare. Eating too expensively laught. Eating too much nimis. Eating too eagerly ardenter. Eating with too much fastidiousness studiosely. Within this framework, the nature of the food itself became critical. The desire for too expensive or too eagerly sought foods could transform a simple act of nourishment into a moral compromise. Food was also deeply linked to the fall. Eve's apple, though not specified as such in Genesis, cemented the connection between forbidden fruit, knowledge, and sin. Eating was the original transgression, and every meal thereafter echoed with that primal disobedience. Furthermore, the body's humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile, governed health and temperament. Foods were classified as hot, cold, moist, or dry. To eat for pleasure rather than balance was to court physical and spiritual disorder. A hot food like pepper or venison could overheat the blood, stirring not just fevers but carnal passions. Thus, the secret sinfulness of a food often lay in its hidden power to corrupt from within, to inflame the humors and, by extension, the soul. The forbidden fruit reimagined, exotics and spices. In a world where local, plain fare was synonymous with piety and health, the allure of the distant and the exotic was profoundly suspect. Spices were not just seasonings, they were alchemical substances arriving from the mythical East, a place often associated with paradise, but also with paganism, luxury, and moral ambiguity. Pepper, cloves, and ginger, these were the currencies of kings and the bankrupters of households. To covet them was to covet the world. In the monastic context, where diet was meant to suppress desire, the use of spices was fiercely debated. Were they medicinal correctives for bad humors in preserved meat, or were they mere sensual stimulants? The 12th century abbot and mystic, Bernard of Clairvaux, railed against monks who seasoned their dishes with spices to excite appetite. The sin here was studiosity, fastidiousness. The spice was an agent of culinary pride, a deliberate awakening of the palate that should remain dormant. It represented a dangerous curation of experience, a seeking of pleasure so refined it could only distract from God. Sugar, the sweetest danger. If spices were suspect, sugar was downright diabolical in its seduction. An expensive import, initially an apothecary's medicine, it began appearing on noble tables in subtleties, sculpted marvels of pastry and sugar paste. Sugar's sin was its power to mimic, to transform, and to deceive. It could make the sour sweet, the bitter palatable. It crafted edible fantasies, castles, saints, legendary beasts. This was food as outright fiction, a celebration of artifice over God's natural creation. The desire for sugar was a desire for a world remade to one's own taste, a sweetening of reality that theologians might equate with a rejection of God's often bitter providence. Moreover, its hot humoristic property was linked directly to inciting lust. A sugary delicacy was seen as kindling for the fires of the flesh. The carnal feast, meat, heat, and lust. Meat was a powerful symbol of wealth, vitality, and aggression. The Church mandated frequent fish days, Fridays, Lent, Advent, and other vigils, over a third of the year. This was penitential, but it also created a hierarchy of flesh. Red meat, especially venison, the hunt was a noble privilege, and venison was its trophy. But this meat from the deep, wild forest was considered intensely hot and dry. Medical and theological texts warned that it produced thick, burning blood, exciting violent passions and sexual desire. To consume it was to ingest the essence of the untamed beast, risking the animal within the man. For a cleric or a monk to secretly partake of venison was not just a breach of rule, it was an internal surrender to bestiality, a literal incorporation of the savage. Foul and airy flesh, birds, particularly those like capons, castrated cocks fattened for the table, occupied a curious middle ground. Lighter than red meat, they were often permitted to the sick and the elite. But the sin here was one of lot, excessive expense and delicacy. The labor-intensive process of fattening a capon in a dark coop, feeding it a rich diet, was an act of culinary vanity. The resulting flesh, impossibly tender and rich, was a testament to human intervention overriding natural order. It was a meat of contrived luxury, and the craving for its specific texture was a form of gluttonous precision. Offal and innards, the hidden parts. While the poor ate every part of an animal, the upper classes displayed a curious aversion to organs. The liver, heart, kidneys, and especially testicles animal were powerfully associated with the vital essence of the creature. To eat the testicles of a stag, for instance, was thought to transfer virility. This was sympathetic magic, a pagan-seeming belief that lingered in the Christian kitchen. Consuming these hidden meats was therefore a clandestine, almost alchemical act, seeking to absorb power or passion from the animal in a way that smelled of superstition and the old religion. It was a sinful ingestion of potency. The dairy deception, cheese and the ambiguity of decay. Cheese was the great paradox. A product of transformation, it stood between the fresh purity of milk and the finality of rot. Medieval medical authorities, following Galenic principles, were deeply suspicious of it. Cheese was deemed melancholic. It produced thick, cold, sluggish humors, leading to obstructions, bad dreams, and a dulled spirit. But its secret sin was more profound. Cheese was preserved corruption. Its very creation required allowing milk to sour and curdle, a controlled spoilage. In a theological system that venerated the fresh, the new, and the pure, the bread of life, the deliberate cultivation of decay for gustatory pleasure was a transgressive act. It represented a comfort with corruption, a tango with putrefaction. Strong, aged cheeses were particularly problematic. Their powerful odors and flavors were a gustatory affront to moderation, a celebration of the pungent and the earthy over the celestial and the light. To crave a pungent cheese was, in a subtle sense, to find pleasure in a state of controlled rot, a metaphor too close to the mortal condition for comfort. The yeast of pride, white bread and social upheaval. Bread was the ultimate staple, the very symbol of life and Christian community, the daily bread. But not all bread was created equal. A stark hierarchy existed. The coarse, dark pain de ménage of the peasant made from rye, barley, or mixed grains. The finer, wheaten pain de broad of the burgher, and the sublime, snow-white pain de bouche of the aristocracy. White bread was a marvel of exclusion. It required the finest, most sifted wheat flour, with all the bran and impurities removed. Its production was wasteful, demanding vast amounts of grain for little yield. To eat it was to consume status, to literally ingest one's own social superiority. The sin here was pride, the deadliest of all. White bread was not about nourishment, it was about distinction. It physically separated the noble body from the common one, suggesting a different order of being. For a prosperous merchant to secretly desire and procure the white bread of the nobility was therefore a social and spiritual sin. It was an attempt to eat one's way into a high estate, to confuse the God-ordained order through the palate. The bread itself became an icon of aspiration, and the craving for its specific, soft, bland purity was a craving for a sanctified status one had not been granted. It was the yeast of pride, baked daily. The enchantment of transformation, sauces, jellies, and culinary illusions. Medieval haute cuisine was a theater of transformation. Cooks, especially in noble courts, were like magicians, striving to disguise the true nature of food. This practice, known as illusion food, was a profound source of anxiety. Sauces, the mask of flavor. A heavily spiced, complex sauce of wine, vinegar, breadcrumbs, and spices like the ubiquitous cameline sauce, based on cinnamon, served multiple purposes. It preserved, it covered the taste of aging meat, and it created a uniform, sophisticated flavor profile. But the theological worry was this: if God created the chicken to taste like chicken, what right did man have to make it taste overwhelmingly of cinnamon and pepper? The sauce was a mask, a deception. It catered to the sin of studiosity, an over-refinement of taste that moved away from God's intended creation towards human artifice. Jellies and galantines, the alchemy of appearances. The pinnacle of this artifice was the jelly. Meats, fish, or fruits would be cooked, shredded, and then reset in their own broth, clarified and cooled into a shimmering, quivering mosaic. A dish might be presented as a vibrant, jewel-like slab that contained pike, salmon, and almonds, all tasting cold, delicate, and uniformly spiced. This was food stripped of its original, God-given texture and form. It was a culinary lie. To marvel at and desire such creations was to marvel at human ingenuity over divine provision. It was to prefer the illusion to the reality, a dangerous spiritual precedent. In a culture deeply concerned with the distinction between substance and accident, a central point of Eucharistic theology, playing with the accidents of food felt perilously close to blasphemous play. The stimulants, wine beyond necessity, and the mystery of mushrooms. Wine, use a little wine for thy stomach's sake, quoted St. Paul. Wine was a necessity, safer than water, a digestive, a symbol of Christ's blood. The sin was in the how. Drinking for warmth and health was one thing, drinking for the heat of intoxication was another. The finest, sweetest wines from Crete, Malmsey, Greece, and the Levant were particularly dangerous. Their sweetness made them easy to drink in excess, and their exotic origins made them objects of lustful craving ardenter. The sin of drunkenness was clear, but the secret sin was the love of the specific vintage, the connoisseurship that valued the sensual experience of a particular wine's bouquet and body over its sacramental or medicinal utility. This was gluttony of drink, a fastidiousness of the tongue that could empty the soul. Mushrooms and fungi, these grew in silence, in darkness, from decay. They were neither plant nor animal, a classification nightmare. They appeared suddenly, as if by magic, and many were deadly. This combination, their mysterious generation, their link to death, their psychotropic potential in some species, made them deeply untrustworthy. Folk belief often held them as fairy food or devil's fare. To consume a mushroom was to partake of something that existed outside the clear, sunlit hierarchy of creation. It was a gamble with the occult. The desire to eat them, beyond starvation necessity, hinted at a fascination with the shadowy, the ambiguous, and the potentially poisonous, a spiritual recklessness. The secret sins of the sanctified, monastic temptations. The monastery was the front line in the war against gluttony. Rulebooks like St. Benedict's prescribed a simple, abstemious diet. Yet, within the cloister, secret food sins took on a heightened spiritual gravity. The pittance, this was a special allowance of better food, often on a feast day or in honor of a benefactor. A conflict constantly raged. Was the pittance a merciful break from austerity, or a cunning doorway to habitual luxury? The longing for pittance day, the careful calculation of when it might next occur, could become a monk's secret obsession, a calendrical map of anticipated small pleasures that utterly distracted from the opus dei, the work of God. The silence of the refectory. Meals were taken in silence, often accompanied by holy readings. But the very enforcement of silence around food could heighten its sensory impact. The crunch of a crust, the smell of the only hot dish of the week, the taste of the single portion of cheese, in the absence of conversation, these sensations were amplified. A monk could commit a perfect, internal gluttony ardenter, studio zeli without moving a muscle, his mind savoring each morsel with an idolatrous focus. This was the most secret sin of all, a feast of the mind in the midst of bodily denial. The infirmarian's privilege, sick monks were allowed meat and other strengthening foods. The line between legitimate infirmity and malingering for a taste of chicken broth was perilously thin. To feign a humoral imbalance to access the infirmary kitchen was a deception that compounded gluttony with lying, a sin made possible by the very medical theories meant to protect health. The heretical palate. Food as doctrine. Food choices could signal theological rebellion. The Cathars, a dualist heresy sweeping southern France, believed the material world was the creation of an evil god. They practiced extreme asceticism, rejecting all meat and animal products including cheese, eggs, and lard as products of coition, which they condemned. For them, to eat these foods was to partake of evil creation. Conversely, for the Orthodox Christian, the Cathar's pure, vegan diet was not pious but heretical. It was a rejection of God's good creation, a blasphemy against the Creator who declared all things good. Thus, a peasant in Languedoc secretly avoiding bacon might be seen not as ascetic, but as a hidden heretic. The food on one's plate became a secret confession of faith, or lack thereof. The legacy of the longing, from medieval sin to modern vice. The medieval anxieties did not vanish, they transmuted. The secret sinfulness of food slowly secularized into concerns about health, class, and morality. The heat of spices and red meat becomes the Victorian worry about masturbation and overheating the blood. The suspicion of sugar's artificial delights evolves into modern diatribes against its addictive, health-wrecking properties. The pride of white bread transforms into the modern status symbol of artisanal, authentic sourdough. Our fear of processed foods, of jellies, gels, and transformed substances, echoes the medieval distrust of culinary illusion. We have medicalized humoral theory, but the core idea that food directly governs our physical and moral state remains potent. Conclusion: the flavor of fear, the aroma of heaven. The medieval relationship with food was a profound dialectic of fear and desire, a recognition that what goes into the mouth can defile not just the body, but the soul. The foods secretly considered sinful were those that threatened to collapse the delicate boundaries between man and beast, noble and common, natural and artificial, human and divine. They were portals to other states of being, to lust, to pride, to heresy, to a dangerous self-awareness through pleasure. To secretly crave the peppered venison, the sugared subtlety, the quivering jelly, or the pristine white loaf was to feel the pull of a world not fully ordered by God's law, a world of sensation, distinction, and artistry. It was to glimpse, in a fleeting taste, the tantalizing and terrifying possibility of a life oriented not solely toward salvation, but towards the complex, ambiguous, and deeply human experience of delight. In the end, their secret sinfulness lay in this: they made the eater, for a moment, an individual defined by a private pleasure, rather than a soul in a collective journey towards God. They were the flavors of the self, and in a world meant to subsume the self into the divine, that was the most transgressive taste of all. The social corpus and the private gullet. To eat in the Middle Ages was to participate in a public sacrament. The feast hall, with its strict hierarchy of high table and lower benches, was a living diagram of the social body. The lord, the head, consumed the finest fare; the knights, the arms, ate robust meat; the laborious, the feet, subsisted on coarse bread and pottage. This was the social corpus, and any food that disrupted its digestion was inherently subversive. But within this public performance of consumption lay the private gullet, the individual stomach with its own secret cravings. The tension between the two, the body politic and the body personal, was where many food sins festered in shadow. The sins of the soil, root vegetables, and peasant pleasures. If the nobility's sin was pride in exotics, the peasantry faced a more ironic transgression, the sin of finding too much pleasure in their own meager lot. The church and medical authorities promoted a theory of correspondence. The social order was mirrored in the natural. Refined, airy foods foul; white bread suited refined, spiritual people. Earthy, coarse food suited those who labored with their hands. Roots and onions, the earth's embrace. Carrots, parsnips, turnips, and especially onions and garlic were staples of the peasant diet. They grew in the dark earth, were rough and pungent. Galenic medicine held them in low esteem. They were windy, melancholic, and produced crude, base humors. But their secret sin was one of inversion and excess affection. To the clerical eye, a peasant relishing a hearty leek and onion pottage was not just nourishing himself, he was wallowing in his own earthiness, reinforcing his base nature rather than aspiring to a more spiritual state. His contentment with the fumes of the earth was a spiritual complacency. More dangerously, garlic possessed an almost magical aura. A powerful stimulant, it was associated with strength and warding off evil and vampires, a folk belief with ancient roots. For a peasant to eat garlic before a demanding task was to seek power from a low, pungent root rather than from prayer or grace. It was a form of self-medication with a spiritually ambiguous substance, a tiny act of pagan defiance. The strong odor was a social marker, the poor man's spice, but it was also a boundary. To smell of garlic was to announce one's separation from the delicate, perfumed world of the elite, and a defiant embrace of that separation could be seen as a quiet rejection of the divinely ordered hierarchy. Pottage, the sin of ambiguity. The eternal pot, simmering over the hearth, was the center of peasant life. Everything went into it: grains, beans, roots, greens, scraps of meat when available. Its sin was its indistinctness. It was a chaotic, mixed-up substance where boundaries dissolved. This was the opposite of the ordered, segregated dishes of the noble table, the service and confusion. Theologians saw order as godly, chaos was of the devil. To consume, and worse, to prefer, this ever-changing, murky amalgam was to embrace a kind of culinary chaos. It represented a life and a worldview not neatly categorized, which to the medieval mind was inherently suspect. The pottage pot was a world in miniature, and its constant, bubbling melding was a quiet metaphor for a social order that, from the peasant perspective, might ideally be more blended than the elite would ever admit. The female palate, sweets, secrets, and the womb's cravings. The medieval female body was considered cooler, moister, and inherently more lustful than the male. It was a vessel defined by its humoral instability and its reproductive function. A woman's relationship with food was therefore scrutinized through a lens of potential sexual and social disorder. The craving for sweetness. A woman's supposed cold, Moist nature was thought to crave heating and drying foods. Sugar and honey, classified as hot, were believed to warm the womb. This created a dangerous loop. A woman eating sweets to correct her complexion or regulate her menses might inadvertently overheat her passions. The sweetmeat, the candied fruit, the spiced wine, these were not simple treats but pharmacological agents with moral side effects. A woman secretly indulging in a stolen comfort was not just being greedy, she was, in the humoral imagination, stoking the fires of her own concupiscence. Her private craving was a public threat, as her aroused humors could lead her into adultery or seduction. The longings of pregnancy. This medical model gave terrifying potency to the concept of maternal cravings. A pregnant woman's desire for a specific, often rare or out-of-season food was not a whim but a physiological imperative. If unmet, it was believed the mark of the desired food could appear on the child's body, a strawberry-shaped birthmark for an unsatisfied strawberry craving. This placed immense power and burden on the woman. Her private, subjective desire became a public, biological decree. But the flip side was a profound suspicion. Was her craving genuine, or was it a cunning exploitation of this belief to access forbidden luxuries? A noblewoman's demand for oysters in winter or for the first peaches of spring could be seen as a costly, selfish caprice disguised as a medical necessity. Her private appetite held the household ransom, blurring the line between legitimate need and sinful gluttony exercised through reproductive privilege. The fast and the fraudulent, the architecture of avoidance. The liturgical calendar, with its over 100 fast days, was the great architect of medieval eating. Abstinence from meat and often dairy and eggs was a collective act of penance and discipline. But it also spawned a vast, creative, and often secretly sinful industry of avoidance. The ambiguity of fish. The definition of fish became a theological and culinary playground. Was a beaver, because it lived in water and had a scaly tail, a fish? Often, yes. Was a barnacle goose, believed to be born from driftwood, a fish? Frequently, yes, allowing the consumption of fowl on fast days. This was not mere loophole exploitation, it was a semantic shadowland where the letter of the law danced around the spirit. To feast on a fish that tasted, looked, and quacked like a duck was to engage in a form of pious hypocrisy. The sin lay in the intent. One was seeking the sensory experience of meat while technically obeying the prohibition. It was a culinary simulation of virtue. The almond milk deception. In wealthy kitchens and monasteries, the fast day became an occasion for astonishing displays of culinary ingenuity. With eggs and dairy forbidden, cooks turned to almond milk, a luxurious, expensive, and time-consuming substitute. They used it to create cheeses, creams, and butters that mimicked the forbidden originals. A fast-day feast could thus be more extravagant, costly, and delicately flavored than an ordinary meal. The sin here was the inversion of purpose. A time meant for humility, simplification, and shared privation became a theater for private, competitive asceticism. Look how piously we can suffer with these exquisite confections of almond and spice. It turned fasting, a tool to crush the flesh, into a stimulant for the gourmand's imagination. This was perhaps the ultimate secret sin, using the structures of denial to craft a more refined, and therefore more prideful, pleasure. The marketplace of temptation, street food and the urban itch. The growth of towns and cities created a new arena for food sin, the public marketplace. Here, food escaped the control of the manor and the monastery. It was commodified, anonymous, and immediate. Hot pies and pasties, the food of hastiness. Sold by street vendors, these were the fast food of the era. Filled with meat, offal, or eels, they were eaten with the hands, on the go. Their sin was multiple. First, pre-prepare, eating too soon, or hastily. The pious meal was a deliberate, often communal, ritual. Snatching a hot pie while walking to a shop was an act of impatient, individualistic consumption. Second, they were shrouded in mystery. The satirical poem The Piers the Ploughman's Creed warns of pastries filled with dogs and draft unclean animals and filth. The anonymous pie was a gamble, a consumption of the unknown. It represented a break from the known provenance of manorial food, a dangerous step into the anonymous, potentially deceitful world of commerce. To prefer this risky, hasty pleasure was to embrace the moral ambiguities of urban life. Sugared nuts and comfits, the currency of vice. Sold at fairs and by itinerant sellers, these small, sweet items were the equivalent of modern candy. Their portability and affordability made them dangerously democratic. A serving girl could spend a penny on a twist of sugared almonds. The sin here was the privatization of pleasure. Unlike a feast, this was a solitary, secretive enjoyment. A young apprentice could sneak a comfit, its fleeting sweetness a tiny rebellion against his master's control and his meager diet. These sweets were the currency of petty, personal indulgence, the first stirrings of a consumer mentality where pleasure could be bought in discreet, secret packets, apart from the social structures of mealtime. They fed the individual, not the community, and in doing so, they nourished a nascent selfhood that the collective medieval world viewed with deep suspicion. The drunkenness of fruits, the peril of unfermented sweetness. Fruit occupied a precarious place. Fresh, ripe fruit was considered dangerously cold and moist, liable to putrefy in the stomach and cause fevers, fluxes, and humoral imbalance. Physicians advised cooking it, often with honey and spices to heat and dry it. The summer temptation. The secret sin of fruit was its natural, unearned sweetness. Unlike bread, the product of human sweat and skill plowing, sowing, reaping, threshing, milling, baking, fruit simply fell from the tree. It was a gift, yes, but one that required no labor. To gorge on ripe cherries or peaches in an orchard was to partake of a lazy, almost animalistic pleasure. It was Edenic, but with the memory of the fall, the fruit was the original temptress. For the ascetic, the craving for fresh fruit was a nostalgia for a prelapsarian state one was not meant to recapture through the senses. Furthermore, its seasonal abundance led to overindulgence. The drunkenness of fruits was a recognized malady, a literal, physical sickness from overconsumption that mirrored the moral sickness of intemperance. The fig and the date, Eastern seductions. Imported dried fruits, like figs and dates, carried the same taint of the exotic as spices, but with a sweeter, stickier, more carnal connotation. Their texture was fleshy, their sweetness concentrated and cloying. They were often associated with the luxurious, decadent East and with biblical stories of temptation and fertility. To secretly savor a date was to ingest a tiny piece of an alien, sensual paradise, a world of heat and indulgence far from the gray skies and penitential fare of Northern Europe. The alchemist's kitchen, distillation and the search for essence. By the late Middle Ages, a new and profoundly alchemical technology entered the culinary and medical world, distillation. From the alembic came aqua vitae, water of life, the first potent, distilled alcohols, and strong waters infused with herbs, spices, and flowers. Aqua vitae, the spirit within. This was not wine or beer, this was something new, a fiery, concentrated spirit. It was a medicine par excellence, a hot substance in the extreme, believed to cure plague, revive the dying, and aid digestion. But its power was terrifying. To drink aqua vitae was not to drink a fermented beverage, but to consume the very spirit or essence of the grain or grape, liberated by fire. This was a Promethean act. The sin was one of hubris, of seeking the life force, the quintessence, in a bottle. It was an attempt to cheat humoral medicine, to shortcut to warmth and vitality. The secret drinker of spirits, and it was often secret, due to its cost and potency, was not just a drunkard, He was a dabbler in a kind of liquid alchemy, seeking to transform his own internal state through a manufactured, almost magical fluid. It represented the ultimate refinement of gluttony, the pursuit not of fullness, but of pure, burning essence. The legacy in the bones, an archaeology of craving. How do we know these secret sins were real, and not just the paranoid fantasies of preachers and physicians? The evidence is etched in the physical record. Bioarchaeology and dental calculus, analysis of skeletal remains, particularly dental plaque calculus, can reveal microscopic particles of food. The discovery of peppercorn phytoliths in the teeth of a mid-status individual in a northern European monastery, for instance, would be smoking gun evidence of a secret, spicy indulgence contrary to the ideal of monastic simplicity. The kitchen midden versus the cookbook. Archaeological waste pits middens often tell a different story from the idealized depictions in cookbooks. The abundance of certain fish bones on fast day sites, or the remains of young, fattened animals in urban contexts where they were technically forbidden to the lower classes, speaks to the gap between prescription and practice, to the silent, material reality of transgression. Manorial accounts and court rolls. These dry documents tell tales of theft, a rabbit stolen from the lord's warren, a pig taken from the forest. But more subtly, they record unauthorized purchases, a peasant buying white wheat flour instead of coarse rye, a servant spending wages on imported raisins. These are the paper trails of secret cravings, the economic footprints of desires that stepped outside one's ordained station. The world in a bite. The social corpus was a fiction maintained by public ritual, but it was perpetually undermined by the private, rumbling, yearning gullet. The peasant's onion, the woman's sweetmeat, the clerk's street pie, the monk's sip of aqua vitae, these were not just acts of eating. They were declarations of a self that existed outside its assigned role. They were tiny, digestible heresies. The secret sinfulness of food in the Middle Ages was, at its core, about the terrifying, exhilarating possibility of agency. In a world that sought to define you by your birth, your gender, your vocation, and your place at the table, the choice to crave something specific, something inappropriate, something that heated your blood or cooled your bile against all advice, was a claim to an interior life. It was the assertion that the map of the soul did not perfectly mirror the map of society. To taste in secret was to know oneself in secret, and in a culture built on the confession and correction of the self, that private knowledge was the most perilous flavor of all. The journey from that secret, sinful bite to the modern concept of individual taste and personal preference is a long one, but it begins here, in the hidden flavors of the medieval world. The invisible banquet, sin, symbol, and the subconscious. Beyond the humoral theory and social hierarchies lay a deeper, more ancient stratum of the medieval psyche, the realm of the symbolic, the folkloric, and the subconscious. Here, food sinfulness was not merely a matter of church doctrine or medical advice, but was woven into the very fabric of cosmology, storytelling, and dream logic. This was the domain where eating became a narrative act, and every morsel could be a plot point in a personal drama of salvation or damnation. The devil's larder, food in folk belief and demonic pact. Official theology condemned gluttony. Folk belief knew the devil himself was a caterer. He did not merely tempt with abstract vice, he offered very specific, tantalizing meals. The inedible feast. A common folk tale motif across Europe was the devil's feast. A wandering stranger, the devil in disguise, would offer a poor, desperate woodcutter or shepherd a lavish, steaming meal in the wilderness. If the man accepted and ate, he would find himself inexplicably bound in service to the stranger, or the food would turn to ash and worms in his mouth, revealing its infernal origin. The sin here was not just pre-prepare eating too soon without grace, but a more profound dislocation, accepting sustenance outside the bonds of community, family, and Christian charity. The meal offered in the lonely forest was the antithesis of the communal, blessed table. To desire nourishment so keenly that one would accept it from an unknown hand in a godless place was to sever the connection between food and fellowship, making it a transaction with pure, selfish appetite, a contract with the demonic. Butter, blood, and the theft of nourishment. Witches were accused of stealing the poison or substance from their neighbors' crops and livestock. They did this not just to harm, but to transfer that nourishing essence to themselves or their familiars. A common accusation was that a witch, by magical means, stole the richness from her neighbor's churn, leaving behind only thin, spoiled milk, while her own butter came thick and abundant. The sinful food here was not the butter itself, but butter stolen through maleficence. It was nourishment corrupted at its source by envy and hatred. To eat such butter was to consume the fruit of a sin against the entire community's welfare. It transformed a wholesome fat into a condensed spirit of neighborly strife. Similarly, witches were said to concoct foul ointments and potions from unbaptized children's fat or the blood of stolen infants. This was the ultimate perversion of food, the literal consumption of human innocence and life for magical power. It stood as the dark, inverted mirror of the uterus, where consuming divine flesh brought salvation. The dream kitchen, nocturnal cravings and spiritual diagnosis. Dreams were not random, they were messages from God, the devil, or projections of one's humoral state. Dreaming of food was a particularly charged event, scrutinized by confessors and medical practitioners alike. The dream of forbidden fruit. To dream of gorging on ripe peaches, of tasting exquisite spices, or of drinking endless wine was a dire warning. In the monastic tradition, such dreams were clear assaults by the demon of noon demonium meridianum, the spirit of acedia and spiritual slackening, who sought to corrupt the monk through imaginary sensual delights. The dream was not a sin in itself, but a revelation of a latent, secret craving that had taken root in the soul during waking hours. The sin would be to awaken and dwell on the dream's pleasure, to feed the memory of the taste rather than reject it as a demonic snare. Thus, a private, nocturnal experience became a site of spiritual combat. The dream food was a ghostly indulgence, and the desire for it upon waking was a sin of the will. The diagnostic dream. Medical theory held that dreams could diagnose humoral imbalance. A person with an excess of black bile melancholy might dream of eating earth, graves, or black, rotten food. A choleric person might dream of consuming fire or sharp spices. These were not cravings to be satisfied, but symptoms to be treated by a corrective diet. The secret sin here would be to misinterpret the dream as a true desire rather than a bodily alarm. To act on it, to seek out earthy flavors or fiery dishes, would be to deepen the humoral sickness, willfully choosing the path of physical and spiritual disorder. The dream food was a treacherous guide, and the wise individual had to reject its siren call in favor of physician-prescribed opposites. The geometry of sin, shapes, colors, and composite creatures. Medieval aesthetics saw profound meaning in form. God had created a world of orderly shapes. Food that deliberately mimicked or perverted these shapes could be morally unsettling. Gilded food and the sin of false splendor. The practice of gilding food, covering pastries, roasted meats, or even whole peacocks in thin gold leaf, was the apex of culinary pride-lord. But its sin ran deeper than expense. It was a lie of substance. Gold was the most perfect, incorruptible metal, symbolizing celestial light and divine wisdom. To coat a perishable, soon-to-be excreted piece of meat in gold was to cloak corruption in the guise of permanence, to dress the mortal in the livery of the immortal. It was a blasphemous parody of transfiguration. To behold and desire such a dish was to be seduced by a superficial, deceitful brilliance, to prefer the glittering surface to the true, God-given nature of the thing. It was the culinary equivalent of idolatry. Composite beasts, carcantress and the monstrous meal. Court chefs delighted in creating monsters. The carcantress made by sewing the front half of a capon to the back half of a suckling pig, the turducken of its day. These were feats of butchery and stitching, presented as mythical beasts. Their sin was one of artifice against nature's order. God created species distinct. To surgically fuse them on a platter was to play at being a creator of chimeras, to produce a culinary grotesque that evoked the unnatural monsters said to inhabit the edges of the world, the mappa mundi's margins. To enjoy such a dish was to find pleasure in confusion, in the overcoming of natural boundaries. It tickled a transgressive curiosity about forms that should not exist. In an age where physical deformity was often seen as a mark of sin or divine disfavor, consuming an edible monster was a queasy, thrilling flirtation with the taboo. The silence of the saints, extreme abstinence as sacred gluttony. At the opposite extreme from the glutton lay the ascetic saint, whose relationship with food defined their holiness. But here, too, lurked a potential for secret, inverted sin. The anorexia mirabilis, holy anorexia. Women like Catherine of Siena or Angela of Foligno lived on virtually nothing, the Eucharist wafer, perhaps some bitter herbs. They consumed pus from the sick, drank water from washing lepers' sores. This was the ultimate rejection of earthly food for divine nourishment. Yet, in their public starvation, a dangerous spiritual pride could fester. Their extreme abstinence became a form of competitive piety, a gluttony for God. The secret sin was the lust for sanctity through denial. When a holy woman's fasting became a public spectacle, drawing admirers and enhancing her spiritual authority, the line between humble penance and performative, prideful asceticism blurred. Her diet was a public statement that could secretly feed a hunger for spiritual prestige as potent as any lord's hunger for venison. The food she refused became the fuel for a different kind of consumption, the consumption of adulation. The taste of heaven and hell, mystical flavors. Mystics often described spiritual experiences in gustatory terms. They tasted the ineffable sweetness of God's love, or the bitter gall of Christ's passion. For them, earthly food became irrelevant, even disgusting, compared to these divine flavors. The potential sin here was disdain for creation. To reject God's gift of wholesome bread as vile, in comparison to a subjective, internal sweetness risked the heresy of denying the goodness of the material world. It was a different kind of fast, one not of penitence, but of supersession, claiming a private, spiritual banquet that rendered the shared human table obsolete. The Jewish kitchen and the Muslim table, the sin of the other's plate. In the multi-confessional landscapes of Iberia, Sicily, or the Crusader states, food became a powerful marker of religious identity and a source of profound anxiety. The kosher butcher, the halal slaughter. For Christians, the meticulous Jewish and Muslim dietary laws could seem both absurdly fastidious and unnervingly pious. The refusal of a Jewish neighbor to eat pork was not just a difference. To the medieval Christian mind, it could be read as a stubborn rejection of Christian liberation from old law, or worse, a silent accusation that Christian food was unclean. The secret suspicion was that these other foods, prepared under different prayers and rules, held a different, perhaps rival, spiritual potency. To be tempted by a savory Adafina, a Jewish Sabbath stew simmering next door, was not just a gastronomic curiosity, it was a temptation to cross a theological boundary, to taste the sustenance of a faith deemed heretical or infidel. The shared meal and the fear of pollution. When social or economic necessity forced commensality, deep fears arose. Could a Christian be polluted by eating food cooked by Jewish hands? Could wine touched by a Muslim be trusted? Canon law wrestled with these questions. The secret sin here was not one of eating, but of indifference, of failing to maintain the gustatory boundaries that reinforced spiritual ones. To enjoy a meal in such company too freely was to risk a kind of spiritual adultery, a mixing of sacred categories at the most intimate, incorporative level. The food of the other was a Trojan horse for the soul. The final meal, the ars moriendi and the last temptation. Death was a ritual, and the deathbed was a final battlefield. The ars moriendi art of dying manuals detailed the last temptations the devil would hurl at a dying Christian. Prominent among them was the temptation to gluttony. The final craving. A dying man, his body failing, might be tormented by a sudden, vivid memory of a specific taste, his mother's honey cake, the wine of his youth, a ripe summer berry. The devil would magnify this memory, urging him to desire it one last time, to cling to the sensory world as his soul struggled to depart. To yield, even in thought, was a catastrophic final sin, a last-minute anchoring of the soul to the flesh. The pious death was one of release, of turning the palate toward God. The craving for a earthly flavor was the literal antithesis of this, a grasping for dust on the threshold of eternity. The last food sin was the most poignant, a testament to the human animal's irreducible love for the tastes of the world, even when the soul was called to a feast of a different order. The sin of the survivors, the funeral feast. The merry wake or funeral feast was a universal practice, a reaffirmation of community in the face of loss. But it always risked tipping into its opposite. The line between commemorating the dead and reveling in the pleasures of the living was thin. To drink too heartily, to feast too lavishly in the shadow of the corpse, was to commit a sin of callousness and forgetfulness. It turned a rite of mourning into a celebration of one's own survival and appetite. The food, meant to bind the community in grief, could instead become an engine of forgetful gluttony, a secret, unspoken declaration that life, and its flavors, went on, regardless of the soul just departed. The echo in the cauldron, from medieval sin to modern neurosis. The medieval framework has dissolved, but its shadows stretch long across our modern tables. We have secularized the theology and medicalized the humors, but the architecture of anxiety remains. The new humoral theory, our obsession with hot inflammatory and cold detoxifying foods, with alkalinity and acidity, with food as the sole determinant of health and moral purity, veganism as secular asceticism, clean eating as a salvation narrative, is a direct descendant. The sin is now toxicity, but the fear of internal corruption by a wrong bite is identical. The geography of guilt, local and seasonal, are our pious virtues, mirroring the medieval trust in the known and the timely. Processed and exotic are our secret sins, the culinary illusions and dangerous luxuries. A microwave meal is our modern illusion food, a deceptive substance whose origins are shrouded in industrial mystery. The ascetics brand, the proliferation of extreme diets, fasting, keto, breatharian-adjacent claims, carries the same whiff of competitive, prideful asceticism as the wholly anorexic. Publicly shared via social media, they become performances of purity, a modern gula for sanctity through denial. The demonic in the addictive, we no longer blame the devil for the irresistible craving, but we have personified the power of certain foods. Sugar is addictive, fat is seductive. We speak of foods calling to us from the cupboard, employing a language of demonic possession to describe our loss of willpower. Conclusion: the unbreakable fast. The medieval world taught that to eat was to negotiate a perilous landscape between necessity and desire, community and self, earth and heaven. The foods secretly considered sinful were those that highlighted this negotiation too brightly, that made the eater aware of their own appetite as a force that could defy God, society, and reason. We, their descendants, live in a world of staggering culinary abundance and endless choice. Our sin is no longer scarcity, but the tyranny of option. Yet, the old ghosts still haunt our supermarkets and our kitchens. The guilt we feel over the imported strawberry in winter, the secret pleasure in the artificially flavored snack, the pride in the artisanal loaf, the fear of the unnatural ingredient, these are the secular tremors of a medieval earthquake. The true, unbreakable fast the Middle Ages imposed was not from meat on Friday, but from the unchallenged sovereignty of the self. Every secret, sinful bite was a momentary declaration of that sovereignty. In the end, their struggle reveals a timeless truth. The table is the first altar, the meal the first ritual, and the choice of what we put into our bodies remains one of the most fundamental, fraught, and telling moral acts of all. We no longer fear hellfire for a bite of spiced venison, but we have built a new cosmology of health, ethics, and status just as demanding. The banquet of judgment, it seems, is always in session. We are all still eating in the shadow of the spire. The metabolism of the soul, internal landscapes and eternal consequences. The medieval universe was not merely hierarchical and symbolic, it was also intensely internal. The cosmos was mirrored in the individual body, a microcosm. The journey of food, from platter to privy, was not just a biological process but a spiritual pilgrimage, its stage is fraught with moral peril and theological significance. To understand the secret sins of food fully, we must follow it into the dark, private interior, into the belly, the blood, and the dreams it spawned. The gastric chapel, digestion as alchemical drama. Once past the lips, food entered a sacred, secret space, the body's own alembic. Digestion was understood as a three-stage process of coction, a cooking by innate heat. The first concoction stomach, the sin of imperfect cooking. In the stomach, food was cooked into chyle. Rich, heavy, or overly abundant foods could overwhelm this gastric fire, resulting in crude or raw humors. This was more than indigestion, it was a moral failure of the internal furnace. To suffer from a cold stomach or crude humors was proof that one had eaten sinfully, too much, too greedily, or foods too cold and moist for one's nature. The physical discomfort, the bloating, the lethargy, was the body's penitential response to the soul's gluttony. A secret, sinful meal would announce itself not just to the conscience, but through flatulence, belching, and pallor. The body became its own confessor. The second concoction liver, the forge of the blood and the sin of bad blood. In the liver, the refined chyle was transmuted into the four humors. This was the body's central alchemical laboratory. The quality of the food directly determined the quality of the blood and spirits produced. Eat the melancholic black bile-producing food like old beef, lentils, or the dreaded cheese, and you literally forged a spirit of sadness and despair within your own liver. Eat the hot, choleric foods pepper, venison, strong wine, and you stoked the fires of anger and lust. The secret sin, therefore, was not just in the momentary taste, but in the ongoing, somatic manufacturing of a sinful disposition. You were what you ate, in the most literal, hydraulic sense. A person prone to wrath might secretly suspect it was not a flaw of character, but a flaw of diet, a hidden, daily indulgence in garlic or game that kept his internal forge producing the fiery humor of choler. The third concoction, individual organs, the final distillation and the sin of specificity. The final stage saw each organ drawing off the specific nutriment it needed from the blood. This was where food sin could become terrifyingly precise. Medical texts suggested that the essence of certain foods traveled to specific organs, the essence of lettuce to the eyes for sight, the essence of nuts to the brain for wit. By extension, the essence of sinful foods, of aphrodisiacal sweets or intoxicating wines, would travel directly to the genitals or the mind, corrupting them at the source. Thus, a secret bite of spiced comfort wasn't just a general stimulation, it was a targeted, physiological assault on the castle of chastity. The evacuative conscience, excretion as moral reckoning. If ingestion was the beginning of the drama, excretion was its final, humiliating act. It was the great leveler, where the Lord's spiced peacock and the peasant's porridge met the same foul end. The necessary shame. Defecation was a blunt reminder of human fallenness, of the soul's imprisonment in corruptible flesh. The Church Fathers wrote of it with disgust. St. Augustine saw in the infant's soiled swaddling clothes proof of original sin. Therefore, any food that excessively involved one with this process was doubly sinful. Laxative foods like prunes or certain herbs were medicinal, but to rely on them for pleasure to clear a burdened feeling or to eat wind-producing foods, beans, onions for their satisfying release was to find a covert, shameful pleasure in the evacuative act itself. It was a secret collaboration with the body's basest function. The sin of retention and the vice of scrupulosity. The opposite was also perilous. Excessive fasting or the wrong combination of foods could lead to constipation, seen as a dangerous retention of corrupt matter within the body. This stagnant matter would putrefy, sending foul vapors up to the brain, causing madness, melancholy, and sinful thoughts. The scrupulous ascetic, in trying to avoid the sin of gluttony, could thus fall into the sin of melancholia by starving his digestive fire. His secret was not a sinful food, but a sinful absence of food, which led to a different, more insidious internal corruption. The ideal was a balanced, regular evacuation, a quiet, unremarked-upon testimony to a well-ordered soul and diet. Any deviation from this silent norm was a potential sign of internal, moral disorder. The food of memory, mnemonic feasts and the sin of nostalgia. In a world before photographs, memory itself was a palace built of senses. Taste and smell were its most powerful architects. Food could therefore be a vehicle for a particularly poignant sin, the sin of misplaced longing. The Proustian Madeleine of the Middle Ages. A taste could unlock a cascade of memory. For a monk, the accidental flavor of a wild berry eaten in childhood might flood his mind with images of a secular home, a mother's love, a freedom lost. This was not a simple recollection, it was a temptation. It was the demon of Accides' spiritual sloth using the palate to make him yearn for a simpler, carnal past over his complex, spiritual present. The sin was in dwelling in that sensory memory, allowing it to become a counter-sacrament to the Eucharist, a private communion with a lost world. The food itself was innocent, the sin was the architecture of nostalgia built upon its taste. The Lord's taste of home. For a knight on crusade, suffering in the Levantine heat, the memory of his wife's barley bread or the brown ale of his homeland could be a torment. To crave it was to crave the entire world he was pledged to leave behind for God's work. A merchant far from home might pay exorbitant sums for a taste of his native cheese, not just for sustenance, but to stitch a sensory bridge back to his identity. This was a secret sin of attachment, a failure of the missionary or mercantile spirit. The taste became an anchor, holding the soul back from its full commitment to its new, harsh reality. It was a gustative lack of faith. The cook as cosmetician and the sin of the second creation. The medieval cook, especially in high-status settings, was not just a preparer of meals but a rival creator. His art stood in a tense relationship with God's. Color as deceit. Using saffron to turn a pottage radiant gold, sandalwood to stain it a pious red, or spinach juice to create a startling green was an act of culinary painting. The sin of studiosely fastidiousness here merged with the sin of deception. Why should a chicken pie be gilded yellow unless to make it appear more precious, more divine, than it was? This manipulation of God-given color was a small vanity, a lie told to the eyes to provoke an undue pleasure. It suggested that nature's own palette was insufficient, that it required human artistry to achieve its full potential, a quietly heretical thought. Texture as artifice. The relentless pounding, sieving, and straining of meats and fruits to achieve smooth, uniform pastes and sieves was an attempt to erase the texture of creation. God gave flesh grain and fiber, fruit pulp and seed. To reduce it all to a homogeneous, silky consistency was to reject the tactile variety of the world, to create a bland, controlled, and ultimately more civilized substance that bore little resemblance to its source. This was food for a palate that feared the accidental, the gritty, the unpredictable reminder of nature's raw state. It was a sin of fastidious control, of preferring the human microcosm's order to the divine macrocosm's vibrant chaos. Flavor as obfuscation. The heavy, complex spicing of so many elite dishes, as noted, masked the original flavor. But this masking could be seen as a form of ingratitude. If God created the pig to taste uniquely of pork, and the cabbage of cabbage, to bury those tastes under a blanket of pepper, ginger, and galangal was to declare those individual creations inadequate on their own. The spice blend, the powder douse, became a universal source, a human-made flavor that sought to supersede the diversity of God-made flavors. To prefer this single, sophisticated taste was to turn one's back on the symphony of creation in favor of a solo composed by man. The economics of appetite, the hidden cost of a secret bite. Every secret craving had a cost that extended beyond the soul's balance sheet. It implicated an entire economic and social network. The peasant egg. A peasant woman's hen lays an egg. By manorial custom, it belongs to the Lord, or a portion of her produce is due as rent. She hides it, and instead of selling it at market to pay a tithe to the church, she boils it for her sick child. This is an act of love, but also a triple transgression: theft from the Lord a civil sin, withholding from the church a spiritual sin, and a personal indulgence in the luxury of fresh, nutritious food the sin of Lot for her station. The simple egg becomes a nexus of secret rebellion. Its consumption is an economic sin before it is a dietary one. The monk's gift. A wealthy patron gives a monastery a gift of wine, fine wheat flour, and sugar. It is meant for the celebration of the patron's feast day. The cellarer, however, secretly diverts a small portion of the sugar and wheat to make a special, subtle treat for the abbot on an ordinary Tuesday, to curry favor. This transforms a communal, liturgical gift into a tool for private advancement and secret pleasure. The sugar sweetness is now laced with the vinegar of simony and flattery. The sin corrupts not just the monk's gullet, but the very economy of grace and patronage that sustains the cloister. The town's secret hunger. In a time of dearth, civic authorities might impose sumptuary laws banning the sale of certain fine foods to ease suffering and prevent unrest. The wealthy burgher who uses a clandestine network to procure a suckling pig or a basket of white flour is committing a sin against the common good. His secret meal is not just gluttony, it is a betrayal of the civic body. His full belly is fed by the community's empty ones. The food's sinfulness is magnified by its social context, becoming inedible treason. The eschatological feast, the heavenly banquet and its earthly counterfeits. All earthly eating was a shadow of a final, ultimate meal, the heavenly banquet, the festum Dei. This was the feast of the saved, united with God, where hunger and want were eternally abolished. This ideal cast a harsh, critical light on all mortal feasting. The empty imitation. The most lavish earthly feast, with its subtleties, its music, its excess, was a pale, grotesque imitation of the celestial reality. To invest one's deepest joy and pride in such an event was, therefore, a kind of idolatry. It was preferring the cardboard scenery to the promised reality. The sin of the great noble's wedding feast was not just in its cost, but in its aspiration. It sought to create a heaven on earth, a fullness of pleasure and community that could only truly be found in the afterlife. It was a performance of eschatology, a heretical attempt to realize the end times through consumption rather than grace. The inverted feast, the devil's Sabbath. In the witch hunter's confessions, the witch's Sabbath was often described as a foul, inverted feast. The food was exquisite to the eye but tasted of ashes and dung. The wine turned to blood or urine. The bread was black and moldy. This was the demonic parody of both the heavenly banquet and the Mass. It represented the ultimate secret sin, to be invited to a feast that promised satiety but delivered only corruption. It was the gastronomic metaphor for sin itself, alluring in anticipation, empty and poisonous in consumption. The witch who confessed to attending such a feast was describing the logical endpoint of all secret, sinful eating, a communion that damned rather than saved. Conclusion: the crumbs of ambiguity. The medieval journey with food was a journey through a world of stark binaries: sacred, profane, hot, cold, noble, common, save, damned. Yet, the secret sins thrived in the ambiguous middle spaces, in the peasant's egg that was both sustenance and theft, in the spice that was both medicine and titillation, in the memory taste that was both innocence and temptation. These secret sins reveal that the medieval person was not a blind follower of rules, but a nuanced, often conflicted, navigator of a dense thicket of obligations and desires. The very secrecy of the act acknowledged the power of the rule even as it broke it. The guilt felt was the proof of a conscience formed by that dense world. We have shattered their binaries. We celebrate exoticism, champion individual taste, and medicalize digestion without reference to the soul. Yet, we have not escaped the fundamental drama. Our organic localism is a search for purity, our food guilt a secular penance, our obsession with authentic flavor a longing for an unfallen taste. We no longer fear hell for a bite of cheese, but we may fear cancer, moral complicity in factory farming, or social judgment. The secret sins of the medieval table teach us that food is never just fuel. It is a language. It speaks of who we think we are, who we want to be, and what we fear we might become. Every meal, even the most secret, is a confession. In the end, the most profound legacy of the medieval sinful food is the enduring truth it unveils. To eat is to interpret the world, and every interpretation carries, within it, the seed of a creed, and the shadow of a doubt. The banquet of meaning is endless, and we are all, perpetually, both its devout communicants and its secregal scressus micro. The aftertaste echoes in an empty hall. The feast of analysis, like its medieval counterpart, must reach a conclusion. But a conclusion is not an end. It is the final savoring, the digestive moment where the rich offerings of history settle into understanding, leaving behind both nourishment and a peculiar, lingering aftertaste. We have traversed the theological kitchens, the humoral forges, the social tables, and the secret larders. We have seen food as doctrine, as demonology, as memory, and as rebellion. What remains is to step back from the laden trestle and observe the empty hall, to listen for the echoes of those silent transgressions in the vast chamber of our own modernity. The reformation of the palate, Protestant plainness, and the new anxiety. The seismic shifts of the Reformation did not simply alter theology, they sought to reform the very relationship between the material and the divine. In smashing the stained glass, they also, metaphorically, shattered the gilded subtleties. The rejection of culinary fiction. For reformers like Luther and Calvin, the Catholic obsession with fast days, distinctions between meats, and the illusory cuisine of meal-disguised foods was a form of works righteousness, a popish superstition. They advocated for a plain, thankful acceptance of God's provision. Friday could be a day for sausage if God provided it. This was a liberation from canonical law, but it forged a new, more internalized constraint. If every day was potentially a feast day, then every day also required a new kind of discipline, moderation as a testimony to faith. The secret sin shifted its locus. It was no longer about violating a church-ordained fast, but about betraying one's own professed gratitude and self-control. To secretly gorge on that sausage, not because it was forbidden, but simply because one lacked the personal fortitude to be temperate, was a failure of the new, Protestant conscience. The sin became more intimate, a private breach of a covenant with God that bypassed the priest and spoke directly to the soul. The communion table stripped bare. The most profound gustatory reform was to the Eucharist itself. The Roman doctrine of transubstantiation was the ultimate culinary miracle, the literal, sensory transformation of bread and wine into divine substance. The Protestant reduction of the Eucharist to a memorial or a spiritual presence, consubstantiation or symbolism, drained the ritual of its culinary magic. The wafer was just bread, the wine just wine. This desacralization of the ritual meal had a paradoxical effect on everyday eating. If the most holy food was now just a symbol, then no everyday food could claim any inherent spiritual potency or danger. This should have freed food from sin. Instead, it placed the entire burden of meaning on the eater's intention. Without the guardrails of liturgical food law, every meal's moral status became a matter of personal inwardness. The secret sin was now entirely in the heart's posture, making it both more invisible and, subjectively, more acute. The scientific dissection, from sin to symptom. The 17th century's scientific revolution began the long process of dismantling the humoral universe. William Harvey mapped the circulation of the blood, not as a vehicle for spirits, but as a hydraulic system. The microscope revealed a world of organisms, not qualities. Food began its slow migration from a moral alchemical substance to a chemical biological one. The end of the culinary cosmos. When digestion was explained by acids and mechanics rather than coction and innate heat, the intimate link between a peppercorn and the passion of lust was severed. Sugar was no longer hot in a galenic sense, it was a crystalline compound. This disenchantment of food should have abolished its secret sinfulness. Yet, the moral categories proved astonishingly resilient. They simply donned new, scientific robes. The birth of the unhealthy. The concept of sinful food metabolized into the concept of unhealthy food. The old fear of internal corruption by the wrong humor transformed into a fear of internal corruption by cholesterol, carcinogens, or toxins. The medieval fast became the modern detox. The ascetic saint who lived on Eucharistic wafers has her echo in the influencer promoting a juice cleanse. The secret shame is no longer of a soul tarnished, but of a body polluted. We confess our dietary lapses not to a priest, but to a personal trainer or a nutrition tracking app, seeking absolution through sweat and kale. The language of moral failure, I was bad, I had a donut, persists, a ghost in the machine of biochemistry. The bourgeois table, secrecy sublimated into etiquette. As the merchant classes rose, the medieval display of excess, the whole roasted ox, the fountain of wine, gave way to a new, bourgeois ideal, the well-ordered, private, familial meal. Sinfulness was sublimated into the intricate rules of etiquette. The secret now is to have none. In manuals like Erasmus's on civility in Children 1530, the focus shifts from what is eaten to how it is eaten. Snatching the best piece, gnawing bones, wiping one's mouth on the tablecloth, these are the new transgressions. They are sins against the social contract of civility, not against God. The secret, sinful craving is forced underground by manners. One may desperately want the last piece of fowl, but one must politely refuse it 3 times. Appetite is corseted by ceremony. The medieval sin of ardenter eating too eagerly is now merely being vulgar. The internal struggle, the secret desire, remains the same, but its expression is policed by a new, secular morality of appearances. The privatization of the banquet. The great hall feasts died out. Dining retreated to private rooms. This made transgression more intimate and, in a way, more possible. The secret bite, the hidden stash, the solitary indulgence no longer had to defy a public spectacle, it merely had to evade the notice of one's immediate family or servants. The geography of sin contracted from the cosmos to the cupboard. The guilt became a domestic affair, a small, silent rebellion against the stifling order of the bourgeois home. The industrial abyss, the sin of ignorance. The most profound rupture came with industrialization. For the first time, the majority of people in the West became utterly disconnected from the source of their food. The medieval peasant knew the pig he ate, knew the field where his grain grew. The urban factory worker of 1850 bought anonymous bread and suspicious meat. The new sin, not knowing. This ignorance bred a new, pervasive anxiety. What was in the food? Victorian cities were rife with adulteration, chalk in bread, copper salts in pickles, lead in cider. The secret sin was no longer just in the consumption, but in the very substance, unknown and uncontrollable. One could be a virtuous, moderate eater and yet be sinned against by the food itself. This transferred the locus of evil from the consumer's will to the shadowy marketplace, creating a paranoia that is the direct ancestor of our modern fears about pesticides, additives, and processed ingredients. The canning jar and the death of season. The technology of canning and, later, refrigeration, performed the ultimate alchemy. It defeated time and season. One could eat peas in December, beef from Argentina in London. This shattered the last vestige of the medieval acceptance of God's seasonal provision. The sin of pre-prepare eating too soon, out of time, was rendered obsolete. But in its place arose a new, aestheticized guilt, the sense that eating a strawberry in winter was not a violation of divine law, but a violation of authenticity, a shallow, pathetic imitation of real abundance. The secret sin became one of phoniness, of participating in a culinary lie. The postmodern palate, the collapse into choice. We arrive at our present moment, a world of staggering, paralyzing abundance. The medieval person faced a limited pantry but an infinite theology around it. We face an infinite pantry but have tried to reduce it to a limited theology of health, ethics, and aesthetics. It has not worked. The cathedral of options. The supermarket aisle is our Gothic cathedral, its vaults lined not with saints but with brands, its theology one of individualism and choice. Every purchase is a silent confession of belief, in organic, in local, in keto, in plant-based, in fair trade. The secret sin is now hypocrisy within one's own chosen creed. The environmentalist who secretly craves a gas-guzzling steak. The wellness guru who binges on junk food in solitude. The complexity of our identities means we are always, in some dietary dimension, a secret sinner. There is no unified moral framework to sin against, only the countless, contradictory microdoctrines we espouse. The data confessional. We quantify our eating with apps, turning our diets into graphs and metrics. This is the ultimate internalization. We are our own inquisitors, monitoring our humoral balance calories in out, macros, micros with a precision that would astound a medieval physician. The sin is visible instantly as a red line on a chart. The guilt is automated. And the act of logging the secret donut becomes a digital confession, with the algorithm offering penance in the form of a projected weight gain or a suggested longer run tomorrow. The nostalgia for the forbidden. In a world with no culinary taboos, we invent them to feel the thrill of transgression. The cheat day is a ritualized, sanctioned sin, a pale imitation of the medieval feast day that followed a fast. We seek out authentic experiences that promise a taste of a time when food had meaning rooted in place and struggle, a meaning that was often forged in the very fires of restriction and fear we now romanticize. The enduring crumbs. So, what remains of the secret sinful foods of medieval times? Not the specific prohibitions, but the structure of feeling they created. We no longer believe a lettuce essence travels to our eyesight. But we believe an omega-3 essence supports brain health. We no longer fear hell for gluttony, but we fear social media shame for our body's shape. We no longer see the devil in a spiced wine, but we see addiction in a sugar rush. The medieval secret was that appetite could unravel the soul. Our modern secret is that appetite can unravel the self-image, the ethical persona, the health project we have so carefully constructed. The food is still a text we read ourselves by. The banquet is still a ritual. The transgression still carries the faint, thrilling perfume of individuality wrested from conformity. In the end, the silent prayer of the medieval sinner over a forbidden morsel and the silent guilt of the modern dietary over a tracked calorie are kin. Both acknowledge a power in food that transcends nourishment. Both confess that to eat is to negotiate who we are in a world that tells us who we should be. The table remains an altar, the fork a tiny scepter of choice, and every meal, no matter how small or secret, a fleeting sacrament, either to the gods of order we serve, or to the delicious, dangerous, human chaos of desire. The hall is empty now. The fire in the hearth is ash. But if you listen closely, in the silence between the ringing of our own time's bells, you can almost hear it, the faint, enduring sound of a careful, secret bite.